He's talked about it being sort of a nuclear wipeout that the US is facing economically, and he's somebody who's very much on the Trump side. But he's saying this is ludicrous and it's really dangerous, and it needs to end. Certainly, Trump has made China the real target for a lot of his anger, but I mean there is some legitimacy to that because China has been undercutting US markets for some time. And actually, when I've spoken to people about this, they are angry that the issues with China were not resolved under the Biden administration, when they perhaps had a more moderate, a more open team that they could deal with. They're saying, why wasn't this thrashed out over the last 4 years? Because we knew that this is an issue that's not going to go away, and you should have taken that opportunity while you had it.
And the accusation, the suspicion that China is on the quiet subsidizing its own industry, from government funds. Seeing, yes, there's private firms in China, but they're very much under the thumb of the government. They're an arm of government when it suits the government, and the government is widely suspected, not just by America, but by the European Union, of pumping state money into those corporations and just subsidizing, which makes the case, or at least part of the case, for the tariffs that we're seeing and the trade war that's coming from Donald Trump. But it raises all sorts of huge questions, doesn't it, Anna?
Like the US subsidizes agriculture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, but I'm making a point here that maybe the Americans have got a point when it comes to China, and as Europe has in the past. But as that war takes off, there's a massive question about the power balance in the world.
Well,
China
I mean, the tariffs he's threatening today on China would be more than 100%. And that is because he's put tariffs on China. China has reciprocated, and he says, well, if you're going to reciprocate and balance tariffs, I'm just going to bid you up to tariffs of 100%. Now, any economist would tell you that tariffs of 100% are economic madness.
Well, I think part of this as well is we talk about what should the UK do, what should the UK government do. It's almost irrelevant because whatever they do, and even if they don't go into any kind of escalation, and nor does the EU, just being in between this global trade war between the US and China, the two economic giants, the level of effects that we will just get buffeted by that will be huge.
And the backwash is that potentially we get dumping because China doesn't send to America, so it sends goods here, which is one of the things that they were talking about in the electronic car industry today, that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor were talking about. Similarly, if we get a trade deal with America, that may, in the view of the rest of the world, look like American dumping into the UK.
Caught in the middle. And China is very, very ready to offer out the hand of friendship and relationships with countries that are going to feel spurned and scorned by America, which raises all sorts of questions, the same questions about the threat from a potential adversary in China, but just now magnified because people are going to be looking in the direction of China for the sort of support that they will feel they need now.
They will, but the interesting thing of all of this is it will be a real test of China's actual economic might, because there's a difference between how China projects itself and what critics say is the actual truth. And they do say that there has been a lot of propping up of industry, and that perhaps that there are much more significant weaknesses in there. So really, this trade war could really test that and see. I mean, it's essentially two big poker players, and we know that Donald Trump is a poker player, facing each other down and seeing who folds first.
Yeah, so that's China. And Harriet, do you get any sense of nervousness in Camp Trump, in Washington, in America, about the world reacting in exactly the wrong way, reacting in the way that maybe Scott Bessent sounds nervous about, getting its heads together, turning into powerful blocks, and then all turning together on America? There's been a little bit of that in the East with South Korea and Japan having talks with China. The European Union has got an awful lot of muscle if it found a way to agree on how to use it. And then if Britain gets involved in that again, well, then again, you're looking at a powerful economic force that America doesn't necessarily want to get on the wrong side of. Do you get any wariness about that, Harriet?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, people are, Republicans are now beginning to say that this is really not in the best interests of the United States. Ted Cruz, before the weekend, who, a staunch supporter of Donald Trump's Texas senator, he said that he's deeply concerned about what this is going to mean and that there could be a bloodbath at the midterms if this carries on. And actually, it was interesting that you had the Trump megadonor speaking, saying, well, it might not be that bad. Another very influential one called Bill Ackerman,
Yes.
who's a hedge funder. He's talked about it being sort of a nuclear wipeout that the US is facing economically, and he's somebody who's very much on the Trump side. But he's saying this is ludicrous and it's really dangerous, and it needs to end. So I think there is a lot of nerves. I think the White House is perhaps divided on this. You have the people like Peter Navarro, who are real hardliners, Howard Lutnick, but then they are coming up against others who are much more responsive, I think, to public opinion. I think the public is pretty concerned about this. It's the topic of conversation everywhere you go in New York right now.
Yeah.
Everyone is talking about, all of these ways in which it's going to put up prices pretty quickly. And cost of living was already a huge issue here in this country. So I think there is a lot of alarm. I certainly don't think it's the case that even within the White House, everyone is in favor of this.
No, sure. And what about Europe? Anna and Adam. I mean, for those who want to see this country get closer to Europe without being too shy, as the Prime Minister and his team seem pretty regularly to be really quite shy about appearing to go back on Brexit. There's never going to be a better time for those who say, look, let's just go for it. Let's ride on in there and forge those closer relationships.
Well, so far it looks as if Europe is behaving like the UK in as much as everyone is considering their positions, and there are clearly consultations going on. And I don't see any sign on either side that either the Europeans or the EU members want to have a war with each other.
No, for sure.
And, these things will develop. Clearly, one of the things that's going to be very important is defence procurement, which brings us back to the whole Ukraine situation, which we've been talking about for a very long time. But so far, the government is absolutely clear. It's not going to rejoin the single market. It's not going to rejoin the customs union, which means, and that may be the sensible approach, that there has to be a new formula of more open trade between Britain and the EU. Of course, the big sticking point in all this, which we haven't mentioned before, but it underlines it all, is migration. Because the free movement of labour is vital to free markets within the European Union. That is a thing which obviously the UK has rejected with Brexit. So how you get around that, we should have to wait and see.
Well, that's going to be is already, and it's not going to go away. That is the stumbling blocks when you thought of going back into the single market. When you go into the single market, you accept freedom of movement of people, as well as the other three freedoms that go with the single market. But you can do a lot more to get closer to Europe without signing up formally to the single market, or for that matter, the customs union.
No, and I think we talked about net zero at the start. I think customs, there will certainly start to be calls to have a customs union that's not called a customs union. It could never be, it'd have to be by another name entirely for it to be sellable to Keir Starmer, but certainly the pressure is going to be increasingly there. And I mean, I think David Smith's coming on soon, but his column pretty much argued that recently. And there are certainly economic arguments, but equally, Brexiteers have come out in force and said this is a massive benefit of Brexit, that the UK has the power to set its own policies. And if there is a trade deal with the United States, they will feel ultimately very, very vindicated.
Yeah. I mean, is it your impression, Adam, that the government, or Downing Street, is just much, much keener on getting much closer to the European Union than they let on?
Not necessarily. My impression is that there's a big argument going on in government at the moment, that there are people who one might see as Blairites and New Labour who think that the only future is closer ties with the European Union. But then there are also people who are worried about losing votes in the famous Red Wall to Reform UK, and who think that any nod in that direction would be a mistake. And indeed, there was certainly an internal argument going on, didn't really break out into the public yesterday, about the briefing that the age of globalization was dead, quotes.
Yeah.
And quite significant. I don't think the Prime Minister said that today.
No.
He just said circumstances have changed. And I think that was an indication of the fact that briefing, which was pretty much designed to appeal to the Red Wall, that globalization was dead, did not go down well within the party, and they had to rethink their language.
Would have been an odd thing to say, wouldn't it?
Well, they said it.
No. So Starmer to have picked up on that theme today and announced the end of globalization.
But that's what the briefing given to the Sunday newspaper,
the briefing was that.
from his officials, was that the Prime Minister was going to say globalisation.
It was all over the papers.
Globalisation is dead.
Yeah.
And he didn't say it.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think there was that's evidence of the internal debate within the Labour Party.
I just think it would have been an odd thing to concede by Keir Starmer.